reading instruction to meet the needs of all learners and all readers. We'll cover some tips and best practices for reading instruction and practice in the classroom, especially with a focus on those students who may struggle with reading. So today we're going to be hearing from an expert on the subject, Dr. David Paige, who I will introduce in a moment. First, just a couple of housekeeping things. Another quick intro, I'm Kathleen. I'm on the text help team here, so I'll be getting the webinar started, and then you'll hear from me again at the end of the webinar as well. So just a couple of quick housekeeping items before we get started. Hopefully you're all connected and you can see the slides and hear my voice okay. If you're not familiar with using the GoToWebinar software, we have just a little screenshot here of what your panel will look something like. So you can control your audio settings there to get the sound coming out the right speaker. All the attendees on the webinar will be muted to ensure a good experience for everybody that's participating. If you have questions throughout the webinar, you can use the questions section of that panel. We have a couple of people on the text help team today, Dina and Shauna, who are going to be monitoring those questions. So they'll keep track of what's coming in. We'll set aside some time throughout the presentation and also at the end to answer as many questions as we can. And I believe there may also be a chat function in there, so if you're having any technical problems, you can send us a chat that way too, and we'll try to get you sorted out. And we'll also be recording the webinar today, so you'll get a copy of that recording as well as a copy of the slides within a few days of the session. So you'll all be able to receive those as well. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce Dr. David Paige, our presenter today. He is an associate professor of education at Bellarmine University in Louisville, Kentucky. He specializes in bridging reading research to instruction with a particular focus on schools and districts whose students may struggle with reading achievement. He's the president of the Association of Literacy Educators and Researchers. He presents regularly at national conferences, and he has research that's appeared in numerous journals focused on literacy and reading instruction. So we're really excited to hear from Dr. Paige today. So without further ado, I will turn it over to him. All right, David, should be all set to get going.
Okay, very good. Well, hello everybody, and welcome to our webinar today. I'm going to turn my camera off since everybody knows what I look like now, and we'll get started here. So the focus of our discussion today, as soon as I get this to go down, let's see. My PowerPoint's not moving here. There we go. Now it's doing it. Okay. We want to talk about differentiated reading instruction, and we're going to put an emphasis on reading fluency today. So why the need for differentiated reading instruction? And really, we want to take a look at this because students are different. They all bring a different set of skills to school. And if we differentiate instruction, we have a much better way of reaching each student with this. And my PowerPoint is just going very slowly here. Well, it's not moving at all. There we go. So when we have whole class instruction, if you're in any kind of a school that has any diversity whatsoever in it, whole class instruction, it reaches part of the class. And that's the big problem lots of times, is you may have students who are, where the whole class instruction is appropriate, but you may also have students who achieve at a higher level than what the focus of the instruction is, or they may achieve at a much lower level or a lower level where the whole class instruction does not benefit them too well. When we talk about reading, we want to first understand that reading is a language-based phenomenon. It's totally around language. And the issue with language is that there can be extraordinary differences between between individuals, between people, between the students that show up in your school, in their facility with language. So there was a study that maybe some of you are quite familiar with, done by Hart and Risley. There's been subsequent research that has supported these findings. What they did, they measured the language exposure of children from the time they were born until they were 3 years old. They took 3 cohorts of infants or of babies, those who lived in a circumstance of poverty, others whose parents were of middle class or perhaps blue collar backgrounds, and others whose parents were professionals. And they set up a mechanism to basically monitor the amount of language that the infant would hear or the child would hear over the course of those 3 years. What they found was that children living in poverty heard about 15 million words over the course of their 3 years. So remember, this is from the time they're born until they're 3 years old. Those from a blue-collar background heard about 30 million words, obviously different words, but that is a measure of just overall language exposure. And those in a professional background heard about 45 million words. So you can see the discrepancy there between 15 and 45, hence the idea or the title, the 30 million word catastrophe. So this is a huge differentiation in the amount of language exposure that children would hear. Not only words, but also phrases, vocabulary, background knowledge, many, many different things that would account for learning differences or for differences in where students were beginning out when they showed up at school. Sorry, my PowerPoint is just not progressing here. There we go. So, you know, the idea being is that reading experiences that children have will vary tremendously among households. Some children will have deep and rich experiences with reading, with language. Others will have some, and there are others who really have none. And this translates into the idea of experiences with text, actual, you know, how much exposure have they had to text and how much time have they spent with this. So while some children have a lot, many children, particularly children attending higher poverty schools, whether it's rural or urban, many children have little to no exposure with text. So when you go and compound that with the idea of language exposure, and then they've had very little exposure to text, we end up with very, very different children. We have schools in the area here where I work, they show up in kindergarten, and some of them, many of them, most of them, in fact, in the struggling schools, are a good 2 years behind. So this whole idea of experience with language, experience with reading or with text or being read to, really changes the trajectory and the places that students are beginning, where they're actually starting out. And this has profound implications for each of you who teach children who come from these various backgrounds. So because of these developmental differences, if all children, if the goal is to have all children reading, then our instruction has to be differentiated. Otherwise, we really are not able to serve the various needs of the children in the classroom. So differentiated instruction, you'll remember this slide previously, we had just a few of the stars surrounded in the middle. Differentiated instruction allows you to reach many, many more children in the classroom. At the same time, it's more complicated, it's more difficult. It requires good assessment skills to be able to understand the various where children are with the various reading sub-skills, such as phonological phonemic awareness, such as letter identification, and things, obviously, letter sound correspondences. So this is some of the ideas around differentiating instruction. So let's turn our focus now to reading fluency. And so we might want to start with, well, what is it, or what is it not? So reading fluency, it's definitely not speed reading. It's not just word calling. So we can think of reading fluency as being able to read text with accuracy, being able to be a smooth reader when you read it. And there's not a lot of stopping and starting, not a lot of repeating. You make your way through the text. And it's also reading with prosody or expression. Prosody is important because we know from research that it facilitates understanding. It's important to understanding a text. So these three indicators, of which neither one of them is fluency, but when you put the three together, you have between pacing, between word identification accuracy, between prosody, they all come together, and the reason they're important is because they facilitate comprehension. We know that in readers who are not fluent readers, that fluency can account for up to half of the differences in reading comprehension. And this is why fluent reading is so critical. It's not good enough to have phonological awareness. It's not good enough to understand phonics or letter sound correspondences. The student must have extensive experience actually reading text. Once they do this, or over a period of time, letters, words, phrases, syntax, it all becomes familiar to the reader and the brain is able to basically focus on comprehension. So let's talk about word identification accuracy. It's closely related to how well the reader decodes. If a reader understands CBC words, that will help them decode those words. However, it may not be quite as helpful as words become more complex and as far as the letter combinations. So we have to have phonics instruction that works really well across a continuum across the various stages of spelling development, around letter naming, within word conventions, syllable juncture, derivational constancy, which gets into morphemes, because all of this then goes to the development of sight word inventory. So the largest predictor of fluent reading would be the number of words that a student knows automatically or by sight. So let's discuss briefly what is a sight word. So a sight word is really any word that is read automatically without the aid of decoding. We don't have to worry about the decoding function. A sight word represents quick and accurate word retrieval from long-term memory. Also, I might mention that with the retrieval of that word comes the meaning of that word. So if the learner has meaning attached to the word, some representation of what it actually means, that's retrieved instantly once it's decoded. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, sight word reading is critical to becoming a fluent reader. And I want to address the idea that lots of times we think of sight words as the initial Dolch words, for example. The, T-H-E is an interesting word that's very difficult. It really doesn't decode. The learner or the student just has to basically memorize that T-H-E is pronounced the. That is an example of a sight word, but so is an example of, say, for example, able, A-B-L-E, which is decodable. The difference being is that, the similarity being that both would be learned to the point where a decoding algorithm is not necessary because the learner has committed these words into long-term memory. So upon presentation of the word, they understand and can pronounce the word immediately. Reading rate, or we call this different things, we might call it reading pace. Some authors will call it automaticity. But in any case, reading rate develops as readers practice with text. Students must have extensive practice with increasingly complex text to encode the various word representations and phrases that I mentioned earlier to have a decent reading rate. Reading rate's related to the reader's sight word inventory. The more words a student understands by sight, the less time they have to expend sounding out the word or determining how to pronounce the word. This all works to lighten what we call the cognitive load for the reader, which we'll talk about here in a minute. We also know that a very loosely defined minimum rate is needed to sustain working memory. Of which we might say that a conversational rate is good, knowing that there's variance across readers in the pace at which they read. Some readers read quite quickly but still have good comprehension. Other readers might read more slowly, just like we have variance in conversation. I'm sure you've all heard people who talk very quickly, others who talk much more slowly. But either way, there's a minimum rate that we need to hear, that we need to read at to sustain the text that goes into working memory. So think of it this way when I talk about cognitive attention. So you have literacy, or you have words that are being read, being lifted off the page by the reader, that goes into the reader's brain. Those words are processed. If they're recognized in long-term memory, they're brought into working memory to form phrases, to form ideas, and then the words are, if it's oral reading, then they're pronounced by the reader. If it's silent reading, most of us still have that little voice in our head that's actually saying the words. So this whole process of identifying words from the page, processing them, and then actually saying the words. And there's cognitive attention. We expend brain power on doing this process. So think of it this way. A disfluent reader has to really focus most of their attention on decoding the words. How do I say these words? So you can see that we have kind of a dichotomous choice here. Either we spend our attention decoding the words, or we spend our critical attention understanding and making meaning of what we read. So a reader who has difficulty decoding words, who, every 8th, 9th, 10th, or 12th word is a problem. They have to figure out how to say this word. Then they have to take their attention and take it away from understanding the message to decoding the word. Take, for example, then the opposite situation where you have a reader who smoothly reads through the text. Decoding the words is not a problem. They maintain some kind of a conversational rate when they're reading. They are then able to take their attention and focus it on creating meaning from the text. So this is a really important differentiation, and it's really difficult to do both at once. You really end up in a situation where you have continuous partial attention. You have to focus on decoding a word. Okay, I've got that done. Now you move on. Now you focus on comprehension. Whoops, here's another word that I don't understand. Now I have to stop, focus on how to say that word, and move on. In the meantime, I've kind of lost track of what the previous words all said because I've had my attention interrupted. So this decoding is really, really an important idea. I wanted to address then, well, what is fluency stamina? We hear the idea or the term of stamina all the time, and I don't think we really understand this very well. So you might think of stamina as the ability to focus your attention on reading over an extended period of time. I'll be in classrooms, I'll hear teachers, I've heard principals, let's focus on practice our reading stamina. And that's really what we're doing, focusing our attention on reading over an extended period of time. However, for a student who doesn't decode well, this is really an exhausting process. They just get physically tired. Their brain gets worn out. And so the extent to which they can decode, to which they are a fluent reader, has everything to do with having fluency stamina. And of course, the other factor is their motivation for reading. If a student's not motivated for whatever reason to read a piece of text, then like most of us, we're going to kind of lose interest, and our stamina for reading might wane in that case. So if we think about a little bit deeper subject about the reading subskills that account for differences between readers. So you can look at this chart that I have with reading comprehension being the ultimate outcome. That's why we do all of this, decode words and focus on fluency so that we can make meaning of what we're talking about. You can think about the left side, which is language comprehension. You can think about semantics, think about syntax, think about letter to sound correspondences, or what we call phonology, the idea of background knowledge, the idea of linguistic knowledge, just knowledge around words. All of this goes to make language comprehension. What we talked about earlier in the webinar, the idea of differences in language between small children, well, this is exactly what we're talking about. So children who've had much deeper and much more exposure to language are going to have all of these various subskills better developed. On the right side of the chart, under reading fluency, you can see the things that go into this. The idea of concepts of print, that idea that text goes from left to right, that these little squiggly designs that we call words actually represent speech, all these concepts of speech. Print, then we talk about phonemic awareness, the idea that the reader can identify the 44 or so phonemes that make up our English language, can differentiate or isolate those phonemes and then manipulate them. The alphabetic principle is simply the idea, the awakening in the child that, gee, these things called words represent sounds. They represent speech that I can actually say. And of course, letter knowledge, and then letter feature knowledge, or phonics, or learning the various letter correspondences that allow us to pronounce words. And sometimes you might think of those as decoding strategies. And then orthographic or lexical knowledge. This would be the words that we have in our working memory or in our long-term memory that we know instantly. All of this goes to make reading fluency. So the idea then of language comprehension and reading fluency combine, and they come together to create reading comprehension. So there's a lot that goes into all of this, and I think the more that we understand these various skills and sub-skills and understand our students and the backgrounds that they're coming from, the better job we can do in helping them to learn to become readers. And so this really gets to the heart of differentiation of instruction and why it's important, because of the variance that we have among students in these sub-skills. So fluency development, it takes place across text. So this heuristic or model that I'm showing you is something that I designed called the Lexile Leap. So when I was putting this together, I got really interested in the Common Core when they were, if you know that, probably are familiar that the Common Core has Lexile grade bands that they put out. Well, the blue lines on this chart represent the grade bands by Lexile. So you can see the blue line goes up, and if you'll notice over at the end of the third grade level where the red line starts, so children leave school at the end of third grade, they come back in the fall of fourth grade, and the Lexile expectations within the Common Core have gone up by 76%. That's the bottom band. So they basically have gone from about 450 up to about 750, 740. It's a huge jump. It's about a 76% jump. This represents a really a conundrum for kindergarten, first, second, and third grade teachers as you hand your third graders off to the fourth grade teacher. How do you know that they're going to be able to navigate this Lexile leap? What can we do to be sure that they do? You may have a student, for example, who on a piece of text might be a very good, fluent reader. They may understand what they're reading. A text might be written at a 500 or 550 Lexile level. Down here, what we're looking at in the spring of, say, second grade. However, they get into fourth grade, and now all of a sudden that text complexity level has gone up by 50% or better. The student is going to notice an extreme difference in how difficult that text is for them to read. So for first, second, and third grade teachers, we really need to be certain that as we're teaching children letter sound correspondences, vocabulary, reading fluency, that we're exposing them to text of increasing difficulty measured by Lexile. Remember, that's just one way to measure text difficulty is Lexile. The Common Core puts out some other ways, qualitative ways to look at it also. But we're looking at the quantitative measure, which is a pretty good accuracy, a pretty good measure of how texts become more complex. So we have to be certain that teachers, students are getting a steady diet of increasingly complex text as measured by Lexile. So as they move up through grades, their competency with increasingly difficult or perhaps complex text continues. But when they get to the end of high school, they're able to read text that's at that 1250, 1280, 1300, 1400 Lexile level, which is what's commonly accepted now as being college and or career ready. So this is an important idea. And we also know that as far as fluency goes, children need to hit pretty much some minimum fluency benchmarks. So for example, if you look at the chart, say second grade, and entering second grader, we would want them to have fluency or an acumaticity or words correct per minute rate of at least 40 words in the winter, We want to see big increases in that to 70, 75 in the spring. So as they progress across 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, they eventually get to a point where they're able to read text appropriately leveled for their grade, at about 150 or so words correct per minute, maybe with some variance, perhaps a little faster, not a whole lot slower. But if we don't monitor this, we really don't know what children are able to do. We don't know if they've really been developed. And with the issues that we have now, where there's just so little reading that children do outside of the classroom, we really have to work extra hard to try to make sure that this reading development is taking place within the classroom. So I'm going to transition now to a few strategies that promote fluency development in children. What are some things that we can do in the classroom to take a look at that? So I'm going to talk about 3 things. I'm going to talk about whole class choral reading, talk about paired reading, and the third one is what we call scaffolded silent reading. So whole class choral reading, and all of these are research-based methods with a lot of research showing that they're effective with readers. But in whole class choral reading, many of you may know, it's a strategy where all students read aloud the same text at the same time in unison with the teacher. It's what we call an assisted reading strategy, and the reason it's assisted is because the student has a lot of support as they're reading. They're able to hear the teacher read. They're able to hear other students around them who may be good, strong readers read the text, so they're able to hear how words are pronounced. Whole class choral reading helps everybody in the classroom. It helps struggling readers, it helps the good readers, it helps average readers, because they're all processing words, they're all becoming more and more familiar with text, they're getting practice. And we know students need a lot of practice to become good fluent readers and to stay fluent as texts increase in complexity. The other great thing about whole class choral reading, it provides struggling readers with anonymity. I call it the big tent of anonymity, because in choral reading we don't call out any one student to read. All students are reading together aloud at the same time. If a student wants to mumble read, that's just fine. It's much better than doing no reading. We don't praise individual students. We don't call out individual students for poor reading. We simply praise the class for reading well, for sounding good, as much like a choir. So what kind of text would you use with whole class choral reading? This is another strength of this strategy. You want to read texts that are part of your curriculum. Whatever you're tasked with teaching, whatever it is, the text that you're presenting, those are the texts that you would use for whole class choral reading. You want texts that challenge the average reader in the class. A common question I get is, gee, I have students who have different reading levels. How do I deal with that? Well, you simply pick a reading level that's going to be somewhat challenging for the average reader of the class, and that's the text that you go with. Remember, whole class choral reading is highly supported. It provides a lot of support for each student. You want texts that just take 2 or 3 minutes to read. You do not want a long text, so you would take one that just takes 2.5 minutes, something like that, to read. A procedure for whole class choral reading would be the teacher introduces the text. You review the words, usually just a handful that you know might be difficult for students to decode, and you just tell them how to say the word. You might want to tell them very briefly what the word means, but we don't want to take the time to make this a vocabulary lesson. You would then read the text aloud to the students while they're following along silently with their text. You would do this, say, for example, on Monday when you're introducing the text. The students then read the text aloud in unison with you. To get them started, you want to use what I call a 3, 2, 1 countdown. The first time you do this, students are going to start at all different rates. They're going to laugh. It's going to be funny. You just do it a few times, and then eventually they'll get to where they can all start at the same time. You set the pace for the class. The readers listen to your voice, and you set the pace. So if it's a text that you know is a little difficult for the class, you might read slightly slower, but not exaggerated, not an exaggerated slowdown. You want to read with prosody. Remember, prosody, many children need to hear prosodic reading. I just got done with a study in middle school, and frankly, the decoding was pretty good, but the prosody was off. awful. I had one student after the other who read like a robot, just in a very flat, monotone voice. And so we know that they're losing comprehension with that. While you're reading, you want to walk the room. You want to turn your voice to different areas of the room so everybody can hear you reading, and you want to make a mental note of the rough spots that you hear from the class, words that they stumble over and phrases that they don't get. After the class is done reading, you want to praise the class. Students, that was a good job. Let's look at how we can improve. You want to encourage the class of what can you improve, their rough spots, maybe review words that you heard that they stumbled over or phrases, maybe talk about prosody. On Monday, I would have them read it at least a couple of times so they have an opportunity immediately based on your input to improve. You want to use a gradual release of responsibility. If you take a repeated reading stance where you read the same passage over several days, then you want to withdraw your support as the students become stronger with the passage. Some other ideas with whole class choral reading. When I was a teacher, I did this and was very successful. I'd record a Monday reading and a Friday reading, and I'd let them hear it and compare and let them hear the improvement. They'll think it's funny, but they'll also hear that they're getting better as readers, and that's really, really important for students to build self-efficacy. You can also use whole class reading for instructions, directions, for other content. Another version that you can do with repeated reading or with whole class choral reading is what we call a wide reading. In other words, you may have a text that they're going to read that's quite a bit longer than 2 or 3 minutes, so you may read part of it on Monday, read a little bit more of it on Tuesday, a little bit more on Wednesday, a little bit more of it on Thursday. So that's another what we call a wide reading implementation. The second strategy is paired reading. So there's extensive research over many decades on this. This is also an assisted reading strategy. The strength of paired reading is that you can use this to engage students in reading for longer periods of time than you would, say, with whole class choral reading. In paired reading, students are paired with another reader, typically a better reader with one who's not so strong. Students take turns reading the text aloud to each other. They might use some sort of a signal that they use with each other and when they want to change readers. The pairs are there to assist each other with pronouncing the words. So that's where we would pair a stronger reader with one that's not quite as good, so that hopefully one of them will know how to pronounce a word that the other one doesn't know. Also in paired reading, we would want them to stop once in a while for some kind of a comprehension check. Maybe they do a brief oral retelling with each other. The idea of matching readers. So I put this together. So think of this. So rank your students from the best reader in the classroom down to the one who might be the weakest. However you choose to do that, but since this is an oral reading strategy, you would probably do this based on some sort of a fluency review or fluency assessment. You then would match, say for example, the best reader with the 12th best reader, the second reader with the 13th, so on and so forth. This is one way to go ahead and try to match up your readers. I would not get concerned whether or not you've got an exact match. Of course, the other issue becomes personality, so you might have to adjust for that in some cases. But this will give you some kind of guidance to run on. I also put a resource site there at the bottom of the screen. The third strategy I want to talk about today is one that you may or may not be as familiar with. It's called scaffolded silent reading. The objective is to increase the students' reading fluency, increase their comprehension, and increase their engagement in text. This got developed by some researchers out at Utah State University back in after the National Reading Panel data came out in 2000. You may be familiar, the National Reading Panel did not endorse independent reading. The reason they didn't endorse independent reading was because there was no evidence to support it as a strategy. Nobody had done any studies that really supported it. The few that were done didn't support it, but there were very few studies. So they really, because it was an evidence-based recommendation from the National Reading Panel, they were not able to come out and endorse independent reading. So this a group of researchers at Utah State went out and decided to put something together to get some evidence in base. So what is scaffolded silent reading? Basically, it's a way for teachers to monitor students as they practice text. And they do this through individual reading conferences with students. So the idea is you're holding the student accountable for their reading. You do this by having the student read aloud occasionally, having them discuss the book with you briefly, having them answer questions that you might ask the student about what they're reading. Have them set goals for completing the reading of the book with some kind of within some sort of a specific time period. Students are encouraged to read widely across various literacy genres. They, as I mentioned, set personal goals for completing it. The conferences with the teacher are really important. You'll be able to figure out really fast whether the student has actually been reading the book or not by your short or brief conference with the student. You might have the student complete response projects where they share the books that they read with other students in the class somehow. So these are all accountability items that we want to do this. I'd encourage you to go and visit this link that goes into an article that goes into depth about scaffolded silent reading. It gives you one more tool, one more strategy to use with your, to engage students in reading with text, in addition to some of the other things that you might be doing in the classroom. So that's kind of the end of the formal discussion right here. So I'm really interested in us going into some questions, looking at anything that I can answer for everybody on this. So send me some questions.
Okay, so Dave, one question we've gotten was about kind of the frequency of doing the variety of reading and fluency kind of strategies that you've mentioned. Is this like a once a day thing? Do you mix and match? How would you go about the frequency and that? Okay,
that's a really good question, and I know that's always challenging. So in your reading delivery model is the way I look at it. So if you're talking, do we have a grade level, by the way, for that question?
We do not. So let's
we do not. Okay.
K through 5.
Okay, so let's think about it in the elementary school setting. So if you're in a K3 setting, for example, or a first, second, third grade setting, where you have your reading instruction, where you're responsible for things like word work, responsible for vocabulary, these types of things, the short answer is you want students involved in reading text every day. They need daily work with text. They have to engage daily with reading. And I would say that goes for all grade levels, including 4th and 5th. If students are not reading text, then they're not going to be forming the connections in the brain around the various letter correspondences, the various nuances between words on the pronunciation. They're not going to be really increasing their fluency. So I would take it back to the Lexile leak diagram, where, remember, one of the things that we're trying to do with reading instruction is to help students become competent readers with increasingly complex text as measured by Lexile as they progress across grades. In 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade, this develops very quickly. The Lexile expectations grow very quickly to get them over that initial hump. On the other hand, students' reading skills are developing very quickly. So with proper letter identification or letter word correspondence instruction, or phonics work, as we might call it, that coupled with a reading connected text. So this needs to go on every day. I think you need to have your kids involved in reading connected text at least 10 or 15 minutes a day of regular time set aside to do that. I do leave discrepancies up to teachers to do this. I think the one who knows best is the teacher in the classroom of what her students need, and the teacher needs to be the designer of the instruction, obviously, that goes on in the classroom based on some assessment of her students or regular knowledge of what the students are doing and how they're progressing. So, but the rule would be, I would say, you've got to have daily fluency engagement. Students must be engaged every day in reading connected text.
Thank you. And one other question we had are kind of what are some of the positives and negatives to silent reading versus reading aloud. You know,
Okay.
when should you do one versus the other? Are there different levels of students that would benefit more from one or the other?
Okay, I think, okay, so fundamentally, the process of reading aloud or reading silently, the same exact mental or cognitive processes are taking place with the exception of articulating the words that are done in oral reading. So the benefits are very good for oral and silent reading. We typically think of a transition to more silent reading as children get out of initial reading instruction. So at the end of 3rd grade or so, we're really expecting them to be able to transition to more silent reading. So they need to have practice doing both. The issue is in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade, because reading is so critical and because we really have this small window of instruction, we have to know that children are developing adequately with their reading skills. The best way to know that is to have them read aloud to you. Number one, they must be, so that you can analyze that. Number two, they have to, as I mentioned earlier, stay engaged with text. They have to be reading text. So the problem becomes when children are reading silently, we're not really sure if they're actually reading or not. A practice I used to see that I don't recommend is, for example, what we call maybe CD reading, where you play a CD of an author or somebody reading a text, and maybe the student is given a text to read along with the author. The problem is lots of times students won't actually read along with the author. They do other things other than reading. So we want to be certain that we have students are actually reading text. So I think if you have students that you know, if you engage them in silent reading time, will actually read, then that's fine. If you have students that you know, yeah, I'm going to have a hard time keeping them on task, then things like choral reading, things like paired reading are better. And of course, scaffolded silent reading is another way to implement and to hold children accountable for their reading. And of course, you may be implementing guided reading, in which case you have students right in front of you reading also. So I think the teacher again has to make the decision whether or not if I engage children with silent reading, are they actually reading? If they're not, then unfortunately it's a waste of time. If they're not actually reading, it's instruction that's not having any benefit. But only the teacher can really make that call in the classroom.
Thank you. One other one we had was, and I think you touched on this briefly, but if you could expand a bit more on some tips to determine the achievement level of your students, and in particular, how you can communicate that to parents so that they can kind of continue the lessons at home and over the holidays.
Okay, very good. So I think this is a really difficult task in most classrooms because I don't think teachers have been provided with good tools. I think the best way to determine, well, there's several ways to determine how the extent to which a student is acquiring reading. What we do here in the project, we have a large project that involves 800 K-3 teachers here in the Louisville area where I'm based, and we recommend a couple of things. Number one, we recommend the Developmental Spelling Inventory by Kathy Gansky. It's very similar to Words Their Way, and there are assessments in there for letter-sound correspondences. I think you have to test that with children who are in first, second, and third grade. We use an abbreviated assessment in kindergarten for end-of-year kindergartners. Kathy Gansky has a kids DSA kids. There are basically 5 CVC words that they do. So I think you have to assess letter sound correspondences in children, especially in K through 3. Number 2, another good way to assess children is through their knowledge of sight words. There are some really good tests. There's one that we use. It's called the Test of Word Reading Efficiency, the TORI, Test of Word Reading Efficiency. It's a commercial test. It's a standardized test. But the great thing about this test is it takes 45 seconds to give it to the student. The student reads a list of regular words that they're very simple and they gradually get more complicated, but they have 45 seconds to read as many as they can. The test is normed, so it's very easy for the teacher to take the test, find out what percentile the student is reading compared to other kids on a nationally normed sample. And that's a very good indicator. Sight word reading is a very good indicator of a student's fluency level. So I like that test a lot. Number three, the third thing that you can do is have students take a fluency passage, and not just any old fluency passage. I would take the Lexile Leap, and so for example, if you have a end of year second grade student, I would take the Lexile Leap. Shows you a Lexile range that they need to be reading at, and I don't have it in front of me right now. Well, let's see, I don't. So construct a passage, a narrative passage that's within 50 Lexile or so of that recommended Lexile passage, and just simply take a running record and compute the correct words per minute. So have them read the text for a minute or two or even three, and then figure out how many words they read, how many miscues they have, subtract the two, divide it down into minutes, and then you'll have a correct word per minute. That's another excellent metric to figure out how they're doing as far as reading. You can go on the internet and get a list of words, not of words, but of acumaticity or reading rates. Anyhow, so there's various metrics. So those are the three metrics that I think you should really look at. Look at their ability to letter sound correspondences, look at their sight word reading ability, and then look at their ability to, in correct words per minute, to read and to understand a reading text. I haven't talked too much about comprehension. Comprehension, of course, is why we want kids to read well. Comprehension becomes a little bit more difficult to assess. Typical way would be they read a passage and answer 4 or 5 questions about a text, some of which might be factual, some of them might be inferential questions. So another way to attest that is to have a child do a brief oral retell of the text. And then you can kind of see, are they able to at least give you the facts that were in the reading? And then at a different level, are they able to take those facts and relate them to perhaps what they already know? So those were some ways to get a handle on that. One thing I might caution there's a lot of schools use the DRA, the Developmental Reading Assessment, Beaver's assessment that she designed. Unfortunately, the levels within those texts are really scattered. So it doesn't, just because a text is a level 24 doesn't mean that the text is much more complicated than what they might read at a level 17 or 18. I did an assessment of those texts around Lexile, which is one way to assess the complexity of a text, and they really weren't very consistent. So you have to be very careful in interpreting or using those texts for assessments. In fact, the authors do not recommend that the DRA be used for assessments. They're very good for using for content, for students to practice, for students to read. The stories that they provide are excellent for kids to read, but using it as an assessment instrument is really not what it's designed to do. So anyhow, so that's kind of thing. That would be a whole nother webinar on how to do assessment with that. So I'm sorry for the brevity in that.
No, that's okay.
Requires a much longer explanation. I have an entire class I teach on that. So, so anyhow.
No, thank you. That's actually a good transition. We're gonna probably pass it on to Kathleen now. And then if we have time at the end, we can do a couple more questions, but good transition for her part, so thank you.
All right, thank you, David. So I am going to close out our webinar today. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. So thank you very much, David, for sharing these really helpful and concrete strategies with us. So I want to close out sort of in parallel with that to talk about one of TextHelp's literacy tools that can really particularly help to address a lot of the challenges that David has identified with, with differentiating reading instruction and making sure to particularly support struggling readers. and can really help with allowing students to become increasingly confident readers, with progressively complex text kind of as they're going through those grade levels as that were discussed earlier. So Fluency Tutor for Google is a Google app, and it makes it really easy for teachers to provide reading content to students. It lets students practice their reading kind of alone on their own time or wherever, whenever it suits them. And then they're able to record that reading and share it directly with their teacher for feedback and for scoring. And so on the student's end, it makes it really easy to get a hold of, text that's tailored specifically to their abilities or their interests or reading preferences. And then on the teacher's end, it makes it really easy for teachers to provide direct feedback to their students and to listen to their students' recordings and keep track of those really important metrics that David mentioned, like words correct per minute and the lexile level that students are reading at. So I want to give you all kind of a quick look at Fluency Tutor and some of the ways that it can be used to apply some of those strategies that were discussed today on the webinar. So if I take a look as a teacher at my Fluency Tutor dashboard, there are a bunch of different ways that I can share reading passages with my students. Fluency Tutor includes a database of about 500 reading passages already built into the app. And they're all sorted or sortable by lexile level as well as reading age, so it's really easy to find content that's perfect for a particular student or group of students that you want to give extra practice to. So when I'm in my dashboard as a teacher here, I can filter by particular lexile level that I'm looking for or reading age, or I can even sort through these passages by topic. So if I wanted to find a passage for a particular student that's interested in sports, I can search for sports and find everything here that might be of interest to them. And again, I can view the lexile level, reading age, word count, all these kind of pieces of information that will help me tailor the content to a particular student. So any of these passages in Fluency Tutor I can share with my students, so I can take a look and preview the content, make sure that it's at the right level for them. Also during the webinar today, we touched on not only the importance of reading fluency, but also comprehension and how that can be tied in. So I can also choose to assign comprehension questions along with that passage to my student. So if I wanted to share this passage about called A Drink for Athletes with a particular student, I can even include those comprehension questions for them. And then because Fluency Tutor is a Google app, if you're a school that's using G Suite for Education, it's really easy to immediately assign this passage to one student by sharing it through Google Drive. Or if you're using Google Classroom, with a click you can share that passage with a group of students. So I could go ahead and share this passage with one of my students. So let's take a look as a student at how I can practice reading this and make a recording for my teacher. So now this is what the passage looks like when my student has received it. So a couple of the strategies that were discussed on the webinar today emphasize the importance of practicing reading multiple times, being able to hear the text, maybe you hear the teacher read text before practicing and reading on your own. So with Fluency Tutor, I could listen to this text read aloud to me first. If I just hit the play button here, it'll read through that whole passage for me. I can even select from multiple voices depending on whether I want to hear a male or female voice. I can change the reading speed. And so I have a chance to really absorb that text before going ahead and reading it myself. There are also a few other support tools that are built in here for students to use. So if I saw unfamiliar vocabulary in this passage, I have the ability to look it up in the dictionary or get an image for it in the picture dictionary. So if I wanted to look up the word doctor, as a student, I could get a dictionary definition here, or I could see an image of that word. So again, lots of tools here at my disposal to kind of help with comprehension prior to making a recording. And now all I have to do here is click the record button, and I can record my reading out loud. I can re-record and listen to myself as many times as I'd like. And when I'm ready, I would just click to send that right to my teacher. And then on the teacher side, There's some really powerful tools that unfortunately I won't really have time to get too in-depth with, but again, one of the important things that was discussed on the webinar today is the importance of tracking Lexile level, tracking words correct per minute, and really monitoring a student's progress through the school year to be sure that they're kind of keeping on track with where they should be reading, so that they're kind of ready for the content as it gets more complex through the different grade levels. So as a teacher, on my teacher dashboard, I can listen to my students' recordings that they've made for me. Right here on my screen here, I can see a kind of list of all the recent activities that they've done. I can even see which of those support tools that they used. So I can see that my student looked up multiple words in the dictionary and the picture dictionary and the translator. And one of the important strategies discussed today was maybe reviewing challenging vocabulary with students either before or after reading. So within Fluency Tutor, I can even create a vocabulary list of those words that the student may have looked up. So if I do that, it's going to create a vocabulary chart right inside of Google Docs, and I can then share it with my student for extra practice or review. So we can take a look at what that looks like. And then kind of the most powerful way that Fluency Tutor can help with reading is giving the teacher the ability to do some really in-depth scoring and analysis of students' reading performance. So I can actually go in, and again, I'll just show this very quickly for you, but you can see kind of all of these statistics and metrics on the right-hand side of my screen are things that Fluency Tutor can automatically calculate for the teacher. I can listen to my students' recording here and mark errors as I go along, and then all these metrics under here like the comprehension score, words correct per minute, percentage of words correct, those will all be calculated for me as I go through and score. And the end result is for a particular student, I'll show you how we can see a nice running record of all of that student's activities through the school year. So you can see I have a list of all of these different assignments that my student has completed. I can go in and see the details of any one of those, and I get a nice running record here of their words correct per minute and fluency scores over time. And this is something that teachers can use to keep track themselves of their students' activities through the school year. They could even go into one of these individual assignments and play back a recording, which I know there was a question about, how can this be used to keep parents in the loop about reading. So you could play a recording of a student's reading from the beginning of the year and from the end of the year at a parent-teacher conference. So a lot of really powerful tools here. So that's just, kind of a very lightning speed look at Fluency Tutor. We'll be sharing some additional resources for you, but there's really a lot of potential within it for supporting struggling readers and also making it easy for teachers to do so and to kind of track student progress through the year. So I think with that, we will close out. Are there any further questions that have come in, or?
No, I think everybody was tuned in.
Okay, great. All right, well, thank you everybody for joining us today. We will be sending a recording of the webinar and a copy of the slides to you shortly, so stay tuned for those. And thank you again to Dr. Paige for joining us. And I think we are all set, so thanks everybody. Have a good evening.